I'm going to start our recording now.
Please do.
Okay, so hi everyone. We are the Gun Rights Group. I'm Sylvia and I have Garrett and Michael here with me. I guess I'm just going to introduce it really quick. So based on like the articles that we read, we kind of just have like a bipartisan issue that's like broken down. And you just have on multiple articles more conservative leaning points of view and more liberal leaning points of view. And it kind of just shows you the dynamic of like, for example, how liberal leaning, how anti-individualistic, or how much it focuses on like the greater good surrounding like gun rights versus like the more conservative, like individualistic approach, which focuses on like values and traditions. There are couple points I'd wanted to make about just each specific one, but more about how like some articles just argue that both sides could prove to be useful if I guess there was like more of like a conversation like around it, like how knowledgeable conservatives tend to be about firearms, but the inability to just have that conversation, and how grounded like in values liberals tend to be when they want to seek like solutions. I more specifically wanted to go in depth about how like media plays a role in this, and the problem with how our system and gun rights wants to compare itself to like other countries, for instance, and why that's not realistic. I think my first point of view was like demographic wise, how you just have different areas of the country where you have like, more rural or conservative areas that have used guns for recreational use more so than like the East Coast and the West Coast, for instance. And I think an issue that I saw more with like the liberal ones, or like the conservative leaning articles that were directed toward the liberal ones, was that liberals tend to want to be very specific about how like gun rights affect us today. And like an instance was like, it should be like state militias that are accessible to guns, but realistically state militias don't exist anymore if you want to like just throw the Coast Guard in there, for instance. I think my other point with like the countries was that just other countries, there was a mention that they don't have the history that the US has. And like what comes to mind for me is like the Revolutionary War, when we tried to like break away from like just a a more tyrannical, I guess, way of running things. And then our history with colonization and how we've just kind of expanded westward, and the method of that, like firearms. I have some more points to make, but I also want to pass the baton on to one of you guys, and then we'll just play off of each other. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take it. Sylvia, what you're saying about the Revolutionary War is exactly why we have, the Second Amendment. It was to protect ourselves against our own government. And you can see throughout the past, anybody who has taken guns away, their civilization, not their civilizations, but their cultures have met crazy demise. From when we disarmed the indigenous people at Wounded Knee, we killed over 250 men, women, and children. From obviously, like I said, King George, we started the revolution because of taxes and he wants to disarm us.
But
Germany.
To be careful with the word we, because of course America includes all kinds of people that aren't included in that, right?
Correct. Sorry about that. But then you can like look into China and how Mao had 65 million of his own people killed, and Mao even has this quote: every communist must grasp the truth. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, and guns are either used as a tool for politics, or, I mean, if you taken away, you're taking away the people's tool to affect the political party that's trying to affect you, And I'm not sure if you guys know what the word domicide is, but it's like murder by the government. And over the last century, it's been the leading cause of death. Over like 200 million people have been killed by their government in ways, and a lot of it's because we, took their way to defend themselves. out. So, I mean, what I was like reading, I like really kind of got into this and looked at all these, different avenues, and from, the Sandy Hook and all these school shootings to, the government's taking, people's, right to bear arms away. It's, it's a very slippery slope and a huge catch-22, because, what do you do? Because these weapons are causing harm, but are they only causing harm when they're in the wrong hands, which is right.
Right.
Garrett, you got anything?
Yeah, I kind of like how you guys kind of touched on the history of guns, and that's one of the big things that I took away from the readings was when we talk about comparing states like Australia and Great Britain, who have these very liberal gun laws where citizens aren't allowed to own guns. It's very hard to compare those to what we have here in the United States because of our vast history with guns. Like, we have such a connection with guns because of the Revolutionary War and the Second Amendment saying the right to bear arms, even though that does have a lot of controversy and ambiguity behind it, with basically like the difference between like individual rights and the militia, like, because the what the Jesuit Post was talking about was how we don't truly know what a state militia is because we have never experienced that. Like, the closest thing would be the National Guard or the Coast Guard, and those would be people that have the right to own arms under that if you're taking it extremely literally. But you also need to have the power to interpret the Constitution, which is something that's very touchy to touch on, and that each side, both conservatives and liberals, kind of use to their advantages to try to get their own ways, while also using that as a way to deter the argument of the other side if it doesn't benefit them. One of the posts where it's talking about Teddy Roosevelt and how he was extremely for gun rights and everything, but they touched on how the situations are extremely different nowadays, where he talked about the best way to exercise and go on a walk is to have your gun on your side. But you got to take into context what he was dealing with back then. He had 5,000 acres of rural land that was mainly wildlife. So it was extremely important for his safety to have his firearm on him, where nowadays there's not much land like that, which is something you really need to take into consideration, especially how the history behind the guns. We have a lot of like white Americans for the most part, who that is part of the culture. You go hunting with your family, it's part of the culture. It's a good way to bond with your family and stuff to do on vacation, while another good portion of Americans, they have never even seen or touched a gun in their lifetime. So it's just extremely important to like understand those differences in guns and just the knowledge of guns when talking about this.
Right.
Yeah.
There was a point that I kind of wanted to branch off of that was if really when this was written in our Constitution, if like recreational use in sport was the idea behind it, and how that's turned into idolizing guns versus the intended purpose for what they were, which was to protect oneself and one's family. It just what of the article that I read, because you see like the stats of, and I mean, this makes sense because after a mass shooting, terrorist attack, you see the spike in guns and the rate of how, people are scared. But, the market for it is huge. And so it kind of puts into perspective is like, are people buying it for like the security blanket and the measure that it is, or, if they just want a gun?
Going off that, I think there was another extremely important part in one of the Jesuit Posts, that one of their articles, where it talked about how nowadays the relationship with like the NRA and other gun manufacturers is they're trying to promote more of a consumeristic idea of the Second Amendment rather than as an individual right. So it's very interesting to think about it that way and how they're just trying to promote their own business for the most part.
It could be viewed as both, Michael.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, like, violence is going to be violence across the board if you take guns out of it or not. Like, the UK has a huge knife problem because they don't have guns. People are always going to commit violent acts if they want to commit violent acts. You know, drugs are illegal in America, but yet we're the biggest consumer of drugs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if there's a will,
United
there's a
Kingdom
way.
does have a big knife problem, but it also has a dramatic drop in the rate of murder.
Yeah, I mean, that is true, but I looked this up. Knife crimes have went up though throughout the UK.
But
And
still a dramatic drop in the murder rate. You don't think that kind of trumps the knife issue? Fewer people are dying.
yeah, but I mean, people are dying every day. But that's not the right response to that.
Oh, it is what it is.
It is what it is. You know, as Stalin said, you know, one death is a tragedy, a million's a statistic. We're never going to get past, you know, people committing violent crimes, and that's part of it. You know,
there's nothing we could do better than Sandy Hook. Well, nothing we could possibly improve.
I mean, okay, so, you know, there's all these background checks you got to do just to get a gun, and there's
except at gun shows.
Except at gun shows, but like, who's committing the crime? You know, children are, correct? Or I mean, anybody really. But like, we could like go back to, I mean, it's not a stretch, but we could go back to like children and their upbringing, because I believe one of the articles did mention, you know, like video games and upbringing, since it's not linked, but it does say like a lot of people that come from like broken homes do go to a life of crime, correct?
There is a lot of evidence that mass shooters tend to be white men who are disaffected with women.
You see, I understand the point you're trying to make there, Michael, but I've, as a person who's played like violent video games like Call of Duty my whole life, I've never had the urge to be like, oh, I think I want to inflict harm on somebody because I've done it in the video game. I've never had that. But also that same article that you were referencing, they also mentioned that 60% of the gun deaths per year are self-inflicted. Yes, and that's very important to note.
Yeah, dude, I played violent video games. I served 10 years in the Marine Corps. I went to Iraq and Afghanistan being a gun. I grew up in Wisconsin. You know, every hunting season, Wisconsin stands up the world's 8th largest army because of the hunters going out in the woods. Like, I grew up with guns. Like, I'm not going to go out and, you know, cause any violent crime by any means. But, you know, coming from these, like the article said, you know, it's not the video games, but it's these homes, you know, and not everything's right. But if you even want to like look at like Roe versus Wade, you know, crime went down 18 years after abortion was legalized. You know, if we got to make people go through all these
documents. I'm for abortion rights. That doesn't persuade me at all.
Well, I guess that's not the point I'm trying to make. If we got to have people register their kids, and if they're financially responsible, if they're mentally capable of raising these kids, you know, then they should, just like owning a gun. If you're not capable of doing something, then you're putting like a bad product out into the environment, potentially.
So we should stop people from getting that, right?
No, we should get,
we shouldn't allow those guns into those bad environments, according to you.
We shouldn't, you know. But then again, like, we got bad apples all over. And if you're going to want to commit a violent act, you're going to commit a violent act. If you're going to want to do drugs, you're going to want to do drugs.
But we couldn't say close the gun show loophole. We couldn't more aggressively enforce background checks. We couldn't keep guns
I
out of
mean,
the
the-
hands of kids.
I mean, the gun,
couldn't
like
require
you can
gun
go to a gun
locks.
show, but like you got to pay more for a gun at a gun show than you would at an actual gun store. You know, by like $1,000. You know,
I
'cause-
think mass killers aren't exactly concerned with saving a buck.
well, yeah,
So,
Ted
so
Kaczynski.
would you say that like purchasing a gun at a gun show then is somewhat similar to purchasing it off the black market because you don't have to go through the regulations and the price is higher than normal?
He is
See, there's
comparing
still-
it to drugs.
So like black market guns and drugs are the same thing, but buying from a personal owner, like, I mean, if I sold you a car and you went out and killed someone with it, is it like my fault that I sold you that car, or is it your fault?
It's obviously not your fault.
Obviously
Yeah, so
not.
that's a gun hole loophole. You know, it's just like buying a personal car from someone. You know,
There was
Well, I don't know. There are certain people you're not allowed to sell cars to because they're underage or unable to drive. You would be responsible in those cases. There would be criminal negligence.
and
Pardon me,
same with
civil
the gun-
negligence, not criminal.
Yeah.
I believe it is the same way with guns, though. There is a legal age to buy guns
Yeah.
with, and you could get in criminal trouble for selling a gun to a minor.
A minor,
or,
yeah.
Except at gun shows. You're right that minors still can't get guns at gun shows, but background checks don't kick in at gun shows like they do everywhere else.
Yeah.
There was one quote in one of the articles that we had to read for this that I thought it moved me and touched me a little bit. It said, if conservatives have a values problem, then liberals have a knowledge problem when it comes to gun rights, which I thought, I mean, that kind of hit me because I've always been like I've been around guns my whole life, but at the same time, like I've never really wanted to own a gun personally or wanted to go out and shoot. Like it was just nothing that I did just because I've been involved with sports my whole life. I really didn't have time for it, even though other members of my family did. But when I talk to very conservative people in my family, there is obviously a values problem when it comes to gun rights because they are thinking about gun rights more as a individual like right, whereas when I feel like that's very contradictory when they're looking at other issues such as abortion or gays' rights, which one of the other articles touched on, which was basically saying that if there was a knowledgeable and intelligent discussion on guns rights from both sides, it would open up this doorway for more abortion rights and gays' rights because it's more of a individual rights to movement, which it also was saying that a lot of liberals would be willing to sacrifice easier gun control laws for a better or more liberal favored abortion and progressive laws like that.
Interesting.
Well, but the Second Amendment is like an individual liberty, you know? And like what the PBS article said is the Second Amendment is not determined by what the Second Amendment means. It's determined by who wins the presidential election, you know, and what they decide what it's going to mean. And as you see, every couple of years, you know, we're changing rules, what's acceptable, what's not. Nothing's ever getting fixed and it's always getting changed.
Well, I would like to draw y'all's attention to a problem with gun statistics in the United States. This is from an ABC News article from October 6th, 2017. It discusses the so-called Dickey Amendment. Quote, passed in 1997 with the strong backing of the NRA, the so-called Dickey Amendment effectively bars the National Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, from studying firearm violence, an epidemic the American Medical Association has since dubbed a public health crisis, end quote. So I would feel a whole lot better about the gun debate if we could have the knowledge that we need. But when one side of the debate is effectively preventing the other side from gathering statistics that could be used in that debate, that doesn't make me want to trust the other side very much.
Yeah.
I imagine he wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, it's an easy enough thing that we should agree that people should be able to collect statistics. That's probably not your burden to disprove. A couple of last things I'd like to call your attention to just before the video ends. The state militia the state militia issue I thought was really interesting because the state militias, of course, that were used in the revolution were entirely grassroots. They didn't have any kind of state component to them. If I was pressed on whether or not like a Montana style militia counted as a militia the way the so-called founding fathers thought of it as, I would probably have to say, yeah, they count. They're grassroots. I may not like their politics, but they're definitely militias. And it was definitely the concern of the so-called founding fathers to make sure that they had their gun rights. The second and last thing I'd like to call attention to is actually a Malcolm X speech. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's nicknamed the ballot or the bullet. In that speech, Malcolm X was, of course, trying to well, I guess he was actually talking to his own people for the purpose of the speech, but he was making the argument that if Black people in America can't get the vote, violence is still a way of solving that problem. And I'd like to ask the group, just shortly, generally speaking, do you think that that is the way, say, for example, Native Americans facing voter suppression in the United States today, do you think they should be considering going to their guns?
That's kind of a tough one, Nicholas, because like if you want to look back at like the suffragettes and their movements for like women's rights to vote and everything like that, they use terror tactics to get their point across, you know. But now, like, what terror tactics are you proposing that people are going to be using with guns? Because the
people fighting for the right to vote are terrorists?
I'm not saying that. I'm
okay.
just saying terror acts, you know, like burning buildings, breaking windows, you know, inciting violence to get your political cause across, you know, like the definition of terrorism. Are you saying give more insight to Malcolm X's transcript, please?
Well, let me ask you maybe a counter question. You're comparing like the breaking of windows to, you say, acts of terror. Surely you think a mass shooting is an act of terror too, don't you?
I do. Just from what I've read in classes, the suffragettes used acts of terrorism to get their point across.
Right, so you agree a mass shooting is an act of terrorism, right?
Oh, of course.
Of course, okay. So then the question, I mean, I imagine you agree that it's okay for white men to fight for their rights using guns, so it's probably okay for Black folks or people of color generally to do the same. Yes?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I mean, but it's not deemed that way. Like when you look at it when it happens.
Not yet.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other thoughts from the? I'm sorry. Pardon me. Go ahead, Sylvia.
No, I was just like saying that. Any last thoughts before we wrap it up?
No.
I just think there needs to be more education about the gun rights in general for both sides, and both sides need to really step in a room and really house a true debate about this and try to find some type of compromise, because they're really just trying to avoid that in general right now, and that's essentially leading to what we have right now. It's just remaining stagnant in what we're facing.
Right.
It seems hard to believe that there couldn't be a better way, a way where most people could get to keep their guns, but we could do more for public safety.
Agree.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Talk to you guys later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.